The morning air was crisp and cold in London as people began gathering along Whitehall Street. November 11th had arrived once again, bringing with it one of Britain's most important traditions. Remembrance Sunday was here, and the entire nation would pause to honor those who gave their lives in service to their country. Inside Buckingham Palace, the royal family was preparing for what many considered the most solemn day in their calendar. King Charles III stood before his mirror, carefully adjusting his military uniform. The dark navy fabric was adorned with medals that told stories of service, honor, and remembrance. Each ribbon and decoration had meaning, representing not just his own service, but the long tradition of royal military involvement. Princess Catherine was getting ready in her private quarters, choosing an elegant black coat that would show proper respect for the occasion. She had learned over the years that every detail mattered on days like this. The public would watch every gesture, every expression, looking for signs of the genuine emotion that Remembrance Sunday demanded. Prince William was reviewing the order of ceremony with his private secretary. As the heir to the throne, he understood the weight of representing his generation's connection to military service. He had served as a helicopter pilot, and the ceremonies always reminded him of the brave men and women who never made it home from their missions. Meanwhile, Princess Anne was checking her own uniform. Known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, she took special pride in military commemorations. Her decades of supporting veterans and military families had given her deep understanding of what this day meant to so many families across Britain and the Commonwealth. The Queen Consort, Camilla, was putting the finishing touches on her appearance. She wore a simple black dress with a poppy pinned carefully to her coat. The small red flower had become the universal symbol of remembrance, representing the blood spilled in conflicts around the world. Outside the palace, security teams were conducting final checks. The route from Buckingham Palace to the Cenotaph had been cleared and secured. Metropolitan police officers stood at regular intervals, their presence both protective and respectful. This was not just another royal engagement. It was a national moment of unity and remembrance. The Cenotaph itself stood silent and imposing on Whitehall, its simple stone design speaking volumes about the gravity of its purpose. Wreaths from the previous year had been removed, and the monument was cleaned and prepared for the new ceremony. The words, "The glorious dead," carved into its surface, seemed to carry extra weight on this morning. Veterans began arriving early, many wearing their old uniforms with pride despite their advanced age. Some came in wheelchairs, others with walking sticks, but all carried themselves with dignity. Their medals caught the weak November sunlight, each one representing moments of courage that most people could never imagine. Members of the public started gathering behind the barriers that would keep them at a respectful distance. Many brought their children, wanting to pass on the importance of remembrance to the next generation. Some carried photographs of relatives who had served and died in various conflicts stretching back decades. The military bands were assembling, their instruments gleaming despite the overcast sky. The musicians understood their crucial role in setting the tone for the ceremony. The haunting melody of the last post would soon echo off the government buildings, creating one of the most moving moments in the British calendar. Television crews from around the world were setting up their equipment. The BBC would broadcast the ceremony live to millions of homes across Britain, while international networks would carry the coverage to Commonwealth countries and beyond. The images of the royal family laying wreaths would be seen by people who still looked to Britain's monarchy as a symbol of continuity and tradition. Inside the Houses of Parliament, politicians from all parties were preparing to attend. On Remembrance Sunday, political differences were set aside. Conservative and Labour members would stand side by side, united in their respect for those who had served their country. The timing of everything was crucial. The ceremony would begin at exactly 11 o'clock, marking the moment when the armistice was signed, ending World War I. This tradition had continued for over a century, connecting modern Britain with the generation that fought in the trenches of France and Belgium. As the royal family made final preparations to leave Buckingham Palace, Each member understood they were about to participate in something much larger than themselves. They would represent not just the monarchy, but the entire nation's gratitude to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The journey from palace to cenotaph would take only a few minutes by car, but those minutes would transition them from private individuals to public representatives of national mourning and remembrance. The weight of that responsibility showed in their serious expressions as they prepared to face the cameras and the crowds. Citizens across Britain were also preparing to observe the 2 minutes of silence, whether they were at the cenotaph or in their own homes. This shared moment of reflection would unite the country in a way that few other events could achieve. The motorcade left Buckingham Palace at precisely 10:30 a.m., moving through the streets of London with quiet dignity. King Charles III sat in the first car, looking out at the crowds that had already begun to line the streets. His face showed the seriousness that this day demanded, but also the deep personal connection he felt to military service and sacrifice. The route took them past St. James's Park, where autumn leaves crunched under the wheels of the royal vehicles. The trees stood bare against the gray sky, their stark branches somehow fitting for the somber mood of the day. London had dressed itself appropriately for Remembrance, with flags flying at half-mast across the city. As the royal cars approached Whitehall, the crowds became thicker and more organized. Veterans associations had claimed their traditional spots, their standards, and banners, creating a colorful display despite the serious nature of the occasion. The Royal British Legion had coordinated the placement of different groups, ensuring that those who had difficulty standing had chairs, and that wheelchair users had clear views. Prince William and Princess Catherine's car followed closely behind the king's vehicle. Inside, they sat quietly, both understanding the cameras that would capture their every expression once they emerged. Catherine's black coat was perfectly pressed, and her hat sat at just the right angle to show respect while maintaining royal elegance. William's military uniform brought back memories of his own service days and the friends he had known who understood the true cost of military duty. The Metropolitan Police had done their job well. Traffic throughout central London had been diverted hours earlier, creating an island of calm around Whitehall. The usual noise of buses and taxis was replaced by the quiet murmur of respectful crowds and the distant sound of military bands warming up. Princess Anne's car carried her toward the ceremony with the same punctuality that marked all her royal engagements. She had always taken special pride in military events, having served as colonel-in-chief of numerous regiments throughout her long career of royal service. Her uniform was immaculate, every detail checked and rechecked by her personal staff. The first groups of military personnel were already in position around the cenotaph. The household divisions stood at attention in their ceremonial uniforms, their bearskin hats, and red tunics creating a striking visual against the gray stone of the memorial. These were the same regiments that had guarded British monarchs for centuries and had fought in conflicts around the world. Members of the cabinet were arriving separately, their own cars bringing them to their designated positions near the Foreign Office building. The Prime Minister would play a crucial role in the ceremony, laying a wreath on behalf of the government and the British people. Political advisors had briefed every minister on proper protocol, ensuring that nothing would detract from the dignity of the occasion. Commonwealth High Commissioners were also taking their places, representing nations that had fought alongside Britain in 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and dozens of other nations would be represented, showing the global nature of the sacrifice being remembered. The crowd pressed against the barriers was remarkable in its diversity. Elderly veterans stood next to young families, their different generations united by respect for those who had served. Some people had been waiting since dawn to secure good viewing positions, bringing thermos flasks of tea and sandwiches to sustain them through the long morning. Television commentators began their coverage, speaking in hushed tones appropriate to the occasion. They explained the significance of various elements of the ceremony to viewers who might be unfamiliar with the traditions. The BBC's coverage would reach not just Britain, but Commonwealth countries around the world, connecting millions of people to this moment of remembrance. The royal family's cars pulled up to their designated positions near the cenotaph, and security officers moved smoothly into position. Plainclothes police officers mingled with the crowd, their trained eyes watching for any sign of trouble. Though Remembrance Sunday crowds were typically among the most respectful and well-behaved of any royal occasion. Church bells across London began to ring, their bronze voices carrying across the Thames and through the narrow streets of Westminster. The sounds seemed to awaken something ancient in the city, connecting this modern ceremony with centuries of British military tradition. Big Ben's famous chimes would soon mark the most important moment of the day. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived in his ceremonial robes, prepared to lead the religious elements of the service. His presence reminded everyone that this was not just a political or military ceremony, but a spiritual one as well. The prayers he would offer would speak for people of all faiths and none, united in their respect for sacrifice and service. Military officers checked their watches and adjusted their positions. Timing would be everything in the coming ceremony. The 2 minutes of silence would begin at exactly 11 o'clock, marked by the firing of a gun at Horse Guards Parade. Every element had to be perfectly coordinated to maintain the dignity and precision that the occasion demanded. The royal family members stepped from their cars with practiced grace, immediately taking on their public roles as representatives of the nation's gratitude. Their faces showed appropriate seriousness mixed with genuine emotion. This was not mere theater. For all of them, Remembrance Sunday held deep personal meaning. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as photographers captured the arrival of the royal family, but even the press maintained a respectful quiet. The usual shouted questions and requests for attention were completely absent. Everyone understood that this was a different kind of royal occasion, one that demanded dignity rather than spectacle. The wind picked up slightly, causing the Union flags around Whitehall to flutter more dramatically. The weather was holding, though dark clouds gathered overhead seemed appropriate for the solemn mood. Nature itself seemed to understand the importance of the moment that was about to unfold. The moment had arrived. At exactly 11 o'clock, the first cannon fired from Horse Guards Parade, its boom echoing off the government buildings and rolling across central London like thunder. Instantly, thousands of people fell silent, creating one of the most powerful moments in the British calendar. King Charles III stood at attention before the cenotaph, his head bowed in respect. The weight of representing the entire nation pressed upon him, but it was a responsibility he had prepared for his entire life. Behind him, the royal family formed a line of respectful figures, each lost in their own thoughts about sacrifice and service. The 2 minutes of silence stretched out like an eternity. In those 120 seconds, millions of people across Britain and the Commonwealth paused their daily activities to remember those who had died in service to their countries. Office workers stopped their meetings, school children stood quietly in their classrooms, and drivers pulled over to observe the silence. Princess Catherine stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes closed in concentration. She was thinking about the military family she had met during her royal duties, wives who had lost husbands in Afghanistan, children who would grow up without fathers, mothers who had buried sons who died too young. The reality of military sacrifice was not abstract to her. She had seen its effects firsthand. Prince William's thoughts turned to his own military service and the friends he had served alongside. Some had gone on to civilian careers. Others continued in military life, but all carried memories of the risks they had faced and the colleagues who hadn't been as fortunate. His time as a helicopter pilot had shown him both the bravery and vulnerability of military personnel. Throughout London, the silence was remarkable. Traffic lights continued to change, but no cars moved through the intersections. Pedestrians stood motionless on sidewalks. Even the pigeons in Trafalgar Square seemed to sense the solemnity, landing quietly and remaining still. Princess Anne's military background gave her a particular understanding of what these 2 minutes represented. She had visited countless military bases, attended numerous military funerals, and met thousands of service personnel throughout her decades of royal duty. The faces of young soldiers and sailors passed through her mind as she stood in respectful silence. The queen consort, Camilla, thought about the family she had comforted at military events, the widows she had spoken with, and the children she had met who were growing up without parents. Her charity work had brought her into close contact with the ongoing cost of military service, not just in terms of lives lost, but families forever changed. Veterans in the crowd stood as straight as their aged bodies would allow, many with tears streaming down their faces. These elderly men and women were remembering friends who had died beside them in conflicts decades ago, faces and names that time had not dimmed. Their medals caught what little sunlight penetrated the November clouds, each decoration representing moments of courage and loss. The second cannon fire marked the end of the 2 minutes of silence, but the emotional impact continued to resonate. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward to lead the opening prayers, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. His words spoke of sacrifice, remembrance, and the hope that such losses would not be forgotten or repeated needlessly. King Charles III moved forward to lay the first wreath. Made of red poppies arranged in a circle, it represented not just his personal respect, but the gratitude of the entire nation. He placed it carefully at the base of the cenotaph, stepping back to bow his head once more before returning to his position. The ceremony that followed was precisely choreographed, but deeply meaningful. Each member of the royal family stepped forward in turn to lay their wreaths. Prince William's wreath bore the colors of the Welsh Guards, reflecting his role as their colonel. Princess Anne's wreath incorporated the symbols of her various military appointments. Commonwealth representatives followed, each laying wreaths that represented their nation's contributions to shared conflicts. The Canadian High Commissioner's wreath reminded observers of the thousands of Canadians who had died in 2 world wars. The Australian representative's tribute honored those who had fought in the Pacific Theater and more recent conflicts. Military bands began to play hymns and ceremonial music, their brass instruments creating haunting melodies that seemed to give voice to emotions too deep for words. The last post echoed off the buildings of Whitehall, its notes seeming to carry messages to the dead and comfort to the living. Members of the public who had gathered began their own quiet ceremonies. Some placed individual poppies at barriers around the cenotaph. Others simply stood in continued silent reflection. Many had brought photographs of relatives who had served, holding these images as their own way of honoring family members who had made sacrifices. The Prime Minister laid the government's wreath with visible emotion, understanding that political leaders bore special responsibility for decisions that sent young people into harm's way. Cabinet ministers who followed maintained the same serious demeanor, setting aside their usual political roles to participate in this moment of national unity. Leaders of opposition parties also participated, demonstrating that remembrance transcended political divisions. In times of war, British political parties had often set aside their differences to present united support for military efforts, and Remembrance Sunday continued this tradition of putting national unity above partisan politics. Television cameras captured every detail, but their operators maintained respectful discretion. There were no zoom-ins on emotional faces, no attempts to capture dramatic moments. The coverage itself seemed to understand the dignity that the occasion demanded, focusing on the ceremony rather than trying to create television drama. The crowd remained remarkably quiet throughout the formal ceremonies. Parents whispered explanations to young children about what they were witnessing, but even these conversations were conducted in hushed tones. Everyone present seemed to understand they were part of something larger than themselves. As the formal wreath-laying concluded, the attention turned to the veterans' organizations that would march past the cenotaph. These elderly men and women represented living links to conflict stretching back to World War II and beyond. Their slow but proud march would be one of the most moving elements of the entire ceremony. The Veterans March began with military precision despite the advanced age of many participants. The Royal British Legion led the procession, their standard bearer carrying the organization's flag with obvious pride. Behind them marched men and women whose combined service spanned nearly 8 decades of British military history. King Charles III took his position on the Foreign Office balcony, where he could review the marching veterans. His salute was sharp and respectful as each group passed the cenotaph. From this elevated position, he could see the full scope of the parade and the thousands of spectators who lined Whitehall to honor these living heroes. World War II veterans came first, many in wheelchairs pushed by younger family members, but some still managing to march under their own power. Their uniforms, carefully preserved or recreated for this annual occasion, bore the ribbons and medals of campaigns in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the Pacific. These men were now in their late 90s or older, representing a generation that was rapidly disappearing. Princess Catherine watched from her position with visible emotion as elderly women from the wartime services passed by. The Women's Royal Naval Service, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force had all played crucial roles in Britain's war effort, though their contributions had sometimes been overlooked in favor of male combat veterans. Korean War veterans followed, their conflict often called the Forgotten War, despite its significance in the early Cold War period. These men had fought in brutal conditions against Chinese and North Korean forces, often in temperatures well below freezing. Their medals included United Nations service ribbons, marking Britain's participation in one of the first major international military efforts. Prince William paid particular attention to the Falklands War veterans, men closer to his own generation who had fought in the South Atlantic in 1982. Some of these veterans showed visible signs of their injuries, walking with prosthetic limbs or obvious disabilities, but maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into them decades earlier. The crowd's applause grew steadily as each group passed, but it remained respectful rather than celebratory. People understood they were witnessing something precious, the annual gathering of men and women whose experiences connected modern Britain to its military past. Each year, fewer veterans were able to participate, making each appearance more significant. Gulf War veterans represented more recent conflicts, including both the 1991 Gulf War and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. These younger veterans brought the reality of modern warfare to the ceremony, reminding observers that military sacrifice was not just a matter of historical record, but an ongoing reality for British forces around the world. Afghanistan veterans received particularly warm applause from the crowd. The war in Afghanistan had lasted over 20 years and had involved thousands of British service personnel. Many of these veterans bore invisible wounds from their service, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions that were only beginning to be properly understood and treated. Princess maintained her military bearing throughout the march, her own experience with military organizations giving her deep appreciation for what she was witnessing. She had spent decades as colonel-in-chief of various regiments and had attended countless military ceremonies, but Remembrance Sunday held special significance even for someone with her extensive military connections. Merchant Navy veterans reminded observers that military sacrifice extended beyond the traditional armed forces. These men had kept Britain supplied during World War II, facing submarine attacks and aerial bombardment while carrying vital supplies across dangerous seas. Their contribution had been essential to Britain's survival during the darkest days of the war. The Royal Air Force veterans included former pilots, navigators, and ground crew from conflicts spanning from World War II to recent operations in the Middle East. Some of the elderly former aircrew had flown bombing missions over Germany, risking their lives night after night to carry the war to Nazi territory. Younger RAF veterans had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, adapting ancient military traditions to modern technological warfare. Naval veterans represented Britain's long maritime tradition, from World War II convoy escorts to modern destroyers and aircraft carriers. Some elderly Royal Navy veterans had served on ships that were later sunk, making their survival and presence at the ceremony particularly poignant. Their younger colleagues had maintained British naval presence in the Persian Gulf and other international waters. The Queen Consort, Camilla, watched the parade with growing emotion as the significance of what she was witnessing became clear. These were not just elderly people in military uniforms, but living repositories of national memory. Their experiences encompassed some of the most significant events in modern British history. Army veterans made up the largest contingent, reflecting the service branch that had typically suffered the highest casualties in Britain's various conflicts. Former infantry soldiers, artillery crews, and tank operators marched past, their units representing famous regiments with histories stretching back centuries. The Guards regiments, Scottish regiments, and county infantry battalions all maintained their distinct identities even decades after their members had left active service. Parachute Regiment veterans received particularly enthusiastic applause, their maroon berets instantly recognizable to the crowd. These elite airborne troops had fought in some of the most difficult operations undertaken by British forces, from D-Day to the Falklands to recent counterinsurgency operations. Special Air Service and Special Boat Service veterans marched without fanfare, their elite units preferring to maintain the low profile that had characterized their operational service. However, their presence reminded observers that Britain's military capabilities extended far beyond conventional forces. Military widows and families of those who had died in service also participated in the march, carrying photographs of husbands, sons, and daughters who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their presence brought immediate reality to the ceremony's purpose, remembering not just abstract military history, but real people whose deaths had left permanent holes in family structures. Representatives from Commonwealth forces added international flavor to the parade, with Gurkha veterans receiving particularly warm recognition from the crowd. These Nepalese soldiers had served Britain with legendary courage and loyalty for over 2 centuries, earning respect that transcended national boundaries. The march concluded with currently serving military personnel, their crisp uniforms, and precise movements showing the continuation of military tradition from past to present. Young soldiers, sailors, and aircrew represented the next generation who might be called upon to make similar sacrifices in future conflicts. As the final veteran groups passed the Cenotaph, the formal ceremony began to draw to a close, but the emotional impact continued to resonate through the crowd and across the nation. King Charles III remained on the Foreign Office balcony, his continuing presence showing respect for every participant in the march past. His salute had remained steady throughout the long parade, demonstrating the stamina and dedication that royal duty demanded. The Archbishop of Canterbury offered closing prayers that spoke to people of all faiths and backgrounds. His words emphasized not just remembrance of the dead, but commitment to peace and understanding in the future. The prayers reminded everyone present that the ultimate goal of remembering sacrifice should be preventing the need for future sacrifices. Television coverage began to shift from the central ceremony to scenes from around Britain and the Commonwealth. In villages across the countryside, smaller ceremonies had taken place at local war memorials. School children had laid wreaths made in art classes. Elderly residents had shared memories of family members who had served, and communities had come together in their own acts of remembrance. Princess Catherine and Prince William descended from their viewing positions to meet with veterans and their families. These informal conversations after the formal ceremony often proved more meaningful than the public pageantry. Veterans appreciated the opportunity to share personal stories with members of the royal family who showed genuine interest in their experiences. In Scotland, ceremonies at Edinburgh Castle and other locations had connected Scottish communities to the London events. The unique contributions of Scottish regiments were remembered, including their service in both World Wars and more recent conflicts. Highland regiments, with their distinctive dress, and traditions had always held special places in British military history. Wales had held its own commemorations, with particular attention to the Welsh Guards and other regiments with strong connections to the Principality. Mining communities that had sent sons to war in previous generations gathered around local memorials to remember their own losses and contributions to national defense. Northern Ireland's ceremonies took place against the backdrop of its own complex military history. Veterans of the Ulster Defence Regiment and other locally recruited units joined with those who had served in regular British forces. The province's unique experience of military service on home soil added particular poignancy to remembrance activities. Princess Anne spent considerable time with veterans organizations, her decades of military involvement having given her personal relationships with many of the people involved in organizing the day's events. She understood the year-round work that went into supporting veterans and ensuring that their needs were met long after their service had ended. The Royal British Legion's representatives explained to younger members of the royal family how the organization continued to support veterans throughout the year. The Poppy Appeal was just the most visible part of their work. They also provided housing assistance, mental health support, and help with employment for those transitioning from military to civilian life. Commonwealth representatives gathered for informal discussions about how different nations remembered shared military history. Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand officials spoke about their own national ceremonies while acknowledging the continuing importance of the London event as a focal point for Commonwealth-wide remembrance. The Queen Consort, Camilla, met with military widows and families of those killed in recent conflicts. These conversations were often the most emotionally challenging part of the day, as she listened to personal stories of loss and continuing grief. Her role in providing comfort and recognition to bereaved families had become increasingly important to her royal duties. Media coverage began to explore the broader significance of Remembrance Sunday in modern Britain. Commentators discussed how the ceremony had evolved over the decades while maintaining its essential character. The addition of veterans from more recent conflicts had kept the event relevant while honoring its historical foundations. Young people in the crowd spoke to reporters about what Remembrance Sunday meant to their generation. Many had learned about military history through family stories, school lessons, or popular culture, but seeing elderly veterans in person brought new reality to their understanding of military service and sacrifice. The economic impact of military service was also part of the day's broader conversation. Veterans' employment challenges, the cost of military health care, and the ongoing financial obligations to those who had served all feature in discussions about how society should honor its commitments to former service personnel. International observers noted how Britain's approach to military remembrance compared to similar ceremonies in other countries. The combination of royal participation, religious elements, and public involvement created a unique model that other nations sometimes copied but rarely duplicated exactly. Security services conducted their own quiet review of the day's events, pleased that the ceremony had proceeded without incident. The combination of high-profile participants and large crowds always created security challenges, but the respectful nature of Remembrance Sunday crowds made their job somewhat easier than other royal events. As afternoon approached, the formal elements of Remembrance Sunday concluded, but its impact would continue throughout the year. Schools would return to lessons about military history. Families would continue conversations about relatives who had served, and organizations would plan for the following year's commemorations. The royal family's participation had achieved its intended purpose of showing national leadership in honoring military sacrifice. Their presence had elevated the ceremony's significance while connecting the monarchy to one of its most important constitutional roles, representing the nation's gratitude to those who had served in its defense. Veterans began their journeys home, many carrying memories of a day that had reminded them their service was neither forgotten nor taken for granted. The younger family members who had accompanied elderly relatives had gained new appreciation for military history and the human cost of the freedoms they enjoyed. The cenotaph itself returned to its usual quiet dignity, surrounded by the wreath that would remain in place for several days as continuing symbols of remembrance. Visitors would continue to come throughout the week, leaving individual poppies and taking photographs that would preserve their own family connections to this national moment. London slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of Remembrance Sunday would linger in the memory of everyone who had participated, whether in person or through television coverage. The ceremony had achieved its annual purpose of connecting past sacrifice with present gratitude and future commitment to peace.